Welcome back to Module 9 of COM 3073, Conducting Communication Inquiry. Today we're going to switch gears a little and talk about survey design. If you're a student in the communication department or have taken a class in the psychology department, surely you have been a respondent to a questionnaire in a survey study. The survey design is flexible, and one advantage of it as compared to lab experiments is its naturalistic quality. Surveys are a very important part of quantitative research, especially for those variables that would be unethical or impossible to manipulate in a lab setting for an experiment. So let's jump into talking more about survey designs in greater depth. Let's first go over the roadmap to give you an idea of the general topic areas we'll be covering today. First, I'm going to define what I mean by survey design and what I mean by the term questionnaire. Second, we're going to turn our attention to response rates in survey design. I'll talk about the relationship among sampling frame, selected participants through a random or non-random sampling procedure, and response rates. We'll also briefly talk about how response rates are calculated and conventional thresholds for good and bad response rates. Third, although I believe you've become more proficient in this area after paper 1, we're going to cover guidelines for selecting and creating good measurement items. Finally, I'll discuss different ways you can array your measurement items in a questionnaire for the best organization and ease in collecting data. One thing I mentioned in earlier videos, but I wanted to revisit here, is the idea that surveying is a method or process, not necessarily just one thing. The survey method or design involves the collection, aggregation, and analysis of responses from measures of different variables bundled in a questionnaire. Now, you might remember that the questionnaire is the collection of measures for your study and their instructions put together in a paper packet or presented in an online form. You'll quickly become acquainted with questionnaires because you're going to have to put together a small one for your final project in this class. The questionnaire is an important part of survey design because it's the tool for collecting data on all your key variables. I wanted to make a quick note about the use of language in experiments and surveys in case you're reading an empirical journal article and get confused by the notation. In both surveys and experiments, we employ the use of participants that we recruit through a random or non-random sampling method. When participants agree to participate in an experiment, they're referred to as subjects. Interestingly enough, when participants agree to participate in surveys, they're referred to as respondents. It would therefore be incorrect to refer to participants in experiments as respondents, and it would likewise be wrong to call survey participants subjects. One thing you can never be wrong about, however, is if you refer to these individuals in your manuscript, regardless of research method, as participants. Response rate is particularly important in survey designs because it can indicate the extent to which your data might suffer from sampling bias. A response rate is a percentage created by taking the total number of people who actually completed the study over the total number of people who were invited to participate. The ability to calculate response rates is sometimes impossible. For example, imagine you try to find participants for your study using convenience sampling by putting up a flyer in the library to recruit participants. You really can't tell how many people were formally invited to the study because it would ultimately depend on who saw and read the flyer. Therefore, response rates are far easier to discern when you know exactly to whom you sent out the questionnaire and see how they responded. As the definition says, response rate is most often expressed as a percentage of those who participated over those who were invited. If every single person participated who you invited, the response rate of course would be 100%. If no one participated, the response rate would be 0%. And if half the people returned the questionnaire completed, the response rate would be 50%. Now let's go over a quick example. Suppose after a simple random sampling procedure, if you recall that's the one with the random number generator, we identified and sent an invitation to 100 potential participants from our sampling frame. A total of 65 people completed the questionnaires and sent them back to us. What would be the response rate? Well, we know the total number of people who were invited, 100, and we know how many people responded, 65. So 65 divided by 100 is 0.65. And if we wanted to change that into a percentage, we would simply multiply this decimal by 100. Therefore, our response rate in this example is 65%. Next, we're going to talk about conventional thresholds for response rate acceptability. There are no hard and fast absolutes when it comes to these rules of thumb, but they do serve as important and helpful guidelines for determining when we might be concerned or when we don't need to worry about specific response rates. A response rate of 50%, which again means that half the participants you invited to the study completed the study, is considered to be just acceptable. This should be looked at as the minimum threshold for you to be somewhat cautious about sample bias, but it's not so alarming so as to redo the study. A response rate of about 60 to 70% is considered to be good. And a response rate of over 70% is considered to be very good. It's best to aim for a very good response rate, but sometimes it's out of your control. You can of course do things to increase your response rates, like incentivize participants with extra credit or gift cards, or including a self-addressed stamped envelope with your questionnaire if you're doing a mail survey. Why is a response rate of under 50% very concerning? It could signal what we call a response bias or a non-response bias. The bias means that there could be systematic reasons why your participants who completed the study agreed to participate, or systematic reasons why certain people decided to stay away. In my studies I conduct on the effects of pornography consumption, I always have chronically low response rates. And I have to be mindful that the sample is typically biased because certain people, like those high in religiosity, tend to systematically reject participation in my studies. There are many different modes to collect questionnaires in the survey method. In the old days, data were often collected through questionnaires sent through snail mail. Questionnaires are rarely delivered through postal mail anymore because of its cost and the fact that researchers or company analysts must take the pencil and paper questionnaire and input it by hand into a computer. Many large nationally representative surveys use the telephone to deliver questionnaires. In fact, if you ever get calls on your cellular phone where it tells you scam likely, the caller is likely to be someone running a large national survey. The most common way by far to collect data for survey studies is through online forms. The most common online data collection companies in academia are SurveyMonkey and Qualtrics. For the purposes of our final paper in this class, I'll ask you to use the less versatile but easier to use Google Forms. The ease, low cost, and accessibility of these online questionnaire hosting websites make them appealing choices for researchers and companies. The final way we collect survey data is through in-person interviews. Interviewers will have the full questionnaire in front of them and ask participants the questions, logging down their responses. If you've ever been to Disneyland, they have many people conducting in-person surveys on something right after the ticket station. I was never asked to participate in the study, so I actually have no idea what they're probing or measuring. There are two different kinds of survey designs I want you to know. The first and by far the most common method of survey design is called cross-sectional surveys. They're called cross-sectional surveys because they're taken at one time point or one cross-section of time. But say you wanted a little bit more information on time ordering of variables. To do this, you would need to collect data from questionnaires given at several time points. If you collect a questionnaire at more than one time point, it's called a longitudinal survey design. There are actually two different methods of longitudinal surveys. One method for collecting data happens when you want to explore generational differences over a certain time period. For example, you might want to follow people who were born in the 1960s to see how their attitudes towards retirement planning has changed in different decades. So you can recruit a different sample of people every 5 or 10 years who were born in the 1960s and give them your questionnaire. The samples will be different, but they will have the same characteristic of being born in the same generation. We call this cohort longitudinal designs. Likewise, you might be interested in following the same exact people over time to see whether changes happen within people. If you follow the exact same sample of participants over time, even if it's just a few weeks rather than a few years, it's called panel longitudinal design. Questions or items in questionnaires can be broken down into two major groups: open-ended questions and closed-ended questions. Open-ended questions ask respondents to provide their own answers to a question you pose. In open-ended questions, there's no set response from which respondents can choose. For example, you might ask victims to report strategies they've used to avoid further cyberstalking. Or you might ask how many times a week a person searches for health information over the internet. Because these are free response questions, meaning that respondents can answer in any way they want, they're considered open-ended questions. Closed-ended questions are a little different. Instead of participants being able to freely respond to the questions, they must choose from a list provided by the researcher. Below are two examples you're already familiar with. The top example is an item based on a semantic differential scale, and the bottom is a Likert type item. Because participants are forced to choose one of the responses already curated for them, these are considered to be close-ended questions. There are numerous ways a researcher can set up a questionnaire and array close-ended items of a measure. A lot of it will be determined by how the original authors of the measure suggest organizing the items, but researchers have some discretion in organizing items in ways that make sense to them. Here are three common methods of presenting items in questionnaires. The first is something that will look familiar to you because this is how our weekly quizzes are arranged. You provide a statement or question and ask respondents which choice best reflects their responses. This is of course known as a forced choice, multiple choice item. The second looks like this. You can see it's just a series of Likert type items, but all items use the same scale, from strongly agree to strongly disagree at the top. So the researcher doesn't need to waste space in the questionnaire by continuing to put a new scale for each item. This organizational method is called a matrix question. Finally, there may be times when you ask a question and the answer to a previous question might make the following questions irrelevant. If you have directions to skip to the next question or move on to question X, this is called contingency questions. You will likely use different variations of these organizational patterns on any questionnaire you put together in the survey method. The following are some guidelines for either creating items of a measure or fine-tuning items of an existing measure. One thing that I want to keep reminding you about is that even though you're using someone else's measure, and even if that measure is determined to be valid and reliable, it doesn't necessarily mean that you as the researcher must use that measure wholesale. I've very routinely taken a measure like the UCLA Loneliness Scale and adapted it to suit my research needs. By adapted it, I mean that I've regularly taken items out that I don't feel are good, changed words around for better clarity within items, and added items for subdimensions I feel are missing or underrepresented. Likewise, if I'm using the measure with children, I try to adjust the language to make it more understandable to them. So even though you're borrowing someone else's established measure, there are still things that you can do to make it better fit your study. Here are some guidelines for selecting or creating good measurement items. The first guideline is to ensure that all of your items are clear. What do I mean by clear? I mean that all of your items should stand alone and be understandable on face. Never should an item leave a respondent asking, "What does the researcher mean in this statement?" When I say that an item should stand alone, everything should be spelled out to its natural conclusion. For example, a bad statement in an item would be, "I think the new class policy is fair." The problem here is with the term new class policy because it might invite speculation about which policy you're referring to. Instead, you can say something like, "I think the new class policy on late work is fair." Here, there's no question about which policy is being referenced in the item. The second guideline is to avoid double-barreled items. Double-barreled items contain statements that touch on more than one issue and yet allow for only one answer. The problem with double-barreled items is that the researcher will never really know what issue the participant was responding to in the statement. This is why it's necessary to avoid double-barreled items. Here's an example. A bad item for a measure would be, "I sometimes feel anxious and lonely." What's the problem here? Two issues are being simultaneously asked about in this item: anxiety and loneliness. You can easily remedy this double-barreled item by separating the item into two different items if both anxiety and loneliness are important to you. You can separate the item into "I sometimes feel anxious" and "I sometimes feel lonely" to avoid the double-barreled item. The next guideline is to simply avoid long items or questions. The problem is that questionnaires are already generally pretty long and participants get easily fatigued when they take them. This is why it's necessary to keep them from getting even more fatigued by keeping items concise and to the point. A bad item for an internet self-efficacy measure would be something like, "I am confident that I can get an action accomplished on the internet or other internet-supported technologies that I intend to get accomplished." This item is long and redundant, which will only serve to frustrate your participant. Instead, a better item would be, "I am confident I can get an intended action accomplished over internet technologies." The item is still bordering on being too long, but each word provides unique and necessary information to get your point across. The next recommendation or guideline is to avoid biased items or questions. Biased items tend to push respondents to an answer based on some established framework or assumption. A lot of biased items begin with "don't you think" or "don't you agree that?" A bad item for a campus survey on leadership would be, "Don't you agree that the leadership on campus is effective?" This item is biased because it's pushing respondents to agree with an already established assumption that leadership on campus is effective. A better way to frame the item would be in a Likert type question with the statement, "The leadership on campus is effective," with choices from strongly disagree to strongly agree. As you can see, the question makes no prior assumptions about the leadership on campus, so it's more fair and balanced. The next guideline is that you need to think about how the items in your measure are framed. By that I mean it's worthwhile to think about the words used in the items because they could prime or activate schemas in one mind that you didn't intend. Here are a couple of examples. A bad item is, I would support welfare. The problem here is that the term welfare may be schematically related in some people's minds to words that have negative connotations. Instead, a fair way to present this statement is, I would support assistance to the poor. Another bad item would be, I would support dealing with the drug addiction problem. The idea of a drug addiction problem is already negatively connoted by the item, so this would not be a fair way to frame an item. Instead, you can say, I support drug rehabilitation programs, to get at the same point without framing the issue in such a negative light. The next guideline is to avoid double negatives in items. Like in practices of good writing, we avoid double negatives because they serve to confuse the reader by obscuring the meaning of the statement. Here's an example. A bad item would be, I am not against having more restrictions on asylum rights. The problem here is, of course, the double negative at the beginning of the sentence, not against. This is especially true when the respondents have to consume the meaning of this item and then respond on a scale from strongly disagree all the way to strongly agree. Instead, it's much clearer to take out the double negative and phrase the item as, I am for or I support having more restrictions on asylum rights. That's all I have for Module 9. Thanks for sticking with me through this video on survey designs. Surveys are very important because they, along with experiments, are the most common ways that we collect data from participants in the quantitative world of research methods. We covered a fair amount of information in today's video. I hope you do feel a little more confident in devising a questionnaire after today's video because you're going to need to put these skills to the test in your final paper. Today, I defined what the survey method is and how questionnaires are used in this method. I talked about terminology related to survey designs and how to calculate response rates. I then talked about the differences between types of survey designs. I told you about cross-sectional surveys and two different types of longitudinal surveys, panel studies and cohort studies. The rest of our discussion focused on guidelines for creating or adapting solid measurement items. As always, please let me know if you have any questions about the readings or the content in this video. Please don't forget to read the textbook pages listed in the syllabus, and don't forget about this module's quiz. Have a great remainder of your week, and I'll see you next time.